Welcome to Within You, the podcast. This is where we explore the unknown together, that liminal space in between worlds. As you navigate, as I navigate, as we all sort of move through what's now and then what's next. Yo soy Vivian Carrasco. I call myself a wisdom teacher, a mindset mentor, and a transformational guide. I'm based right here in Funky Town, which is also called my beloved Fort Worth. And in this episode, we're going to talk about growing in that in-between space, in that liminal space. This is the first of 2 episodes in March, which is the beginning of spring. This is part of a larger framework that we began back in October with setting goals, imagining the future, and then move through the waves of change. And change from the inside, which is typically transformation, moving through transitions, stages in your life, identity changes. But we are using the beautiful metaphor tool that nature gives us. And so we started in the fall in October, moved through winter, and now we have moved all the way into spring. And in the spring, a new reality is emerging. We've got the seeds that we planted that grew through the winter, that nurtured themselves, are now starting to move into the seen world, into something that you can see. So this is when we begin to emerge. And what this episode focuses on is how we emerge. What I'm proposing to you is that we live our way forward. So before I go into the tools that I want to share with you, I actually want to talk a little bit about the difference between the roles we have in life and ourself. So the role that you feel belongs to someone else. It may belong to an organization. It may belong to a group. It may belong to your family. Others react to the role we represent in their lives. A very common example, one that is part of my life, is the role that I have as a mother for my grown sons. In an organization, it may be the role that you're filling that is tied to your job, your vocation, your position in the organization. What we're doing throughout this entire experience and what Within You really focuses on is something deeper than the role you hold for others. It is who you are in your deepest sense of self. And what happens as we move through an outward change that takes us into an inner transformation is that we are finding a way to see ourselves differently. We're exploring ourselves. For me, it was a very necessary journey in learning to trust myself, my SELF, capital S, myself more than the role that I was holding, than the expectations that were surrounding me, that I was sort of swimming through. So the way that I propose that we do this is by moving more and more inside of ourselves, asking ourselves the answers that we'll actually explore throughout our lives, the kinds of questions that have no definitive answers, that you continue to revisit after seasons, after years, after outward changes, as you move through the cycles of transformational change. And those questions are things like, who am I deeper than the roles that I have? Who am I at the essence of myself? What doesn't change for me? Whether I'm being viewed as a daughter, a mother, a wife, a professional, a friend, a sister. So who am I? Another question is, how do I want to feel? How do I want to think? How do I want to look? And what's important here, and there's absolutely no way for me to emphasize this enough for you, what's important here is that this I is regardless of others' opinions. I know how hard that can be. I know how steeped we are in wanting to look a certain way to others, in wanting to be regarded in a certain way to others. And that is part of our experience as being human, as being part of circles, of families, of organizations, of society, living the way that we do. But all I'm proposing for you isn't really to get rid of that, even though it feels like freedom when you do. It's just to have that foundation begin with you. Move beyond thinking that it feels selfish. Move beyond the idea that you can't do that for yourself. You just don't know how yet. So I wanted to start this conversation with you by emphasizing the distinct difference between a role and yourself. How do you distinguish them? How do you differentiate them? And if you haven't, this is a very gentle invitation for you to do that before the growth moves through. It's what has to happen. Otherwise, the earth if this is a gardening metaphor, the dirt will be too hard. It'll be too cold and it won't let you through, because the outside is what has the most force, the most power. So one of the interesting things about this time in our society, in our world, is that the personal changes and the phases that we're moving through are going so fast. The borders and boundaries that we used to have really disappeared, and we are a part of everything a lot more. And so what happens is we can move through these identities faster. We have longer lifespans. 100 years ago, we might have only lived to be 40. Now it's very common for us to live to be 80. So the stages of life for a 40-year-old shift distinctly for an 80-year-old or a 100-year-old. And so this is about those gaps in between significant changes where we evolve our identities in a much more invisible way. It's not as grounded in ritual or ceremony in our outside world, like graduating from high school or graduating from college, or, those very significant things that happen that move us into the next phase. That evolution happens. That identity shift happens within those stages. For instance, my husband and I have been married almost 30 years. Marriage as a marker started almost 30 years ago and will move, the commitment is for life. So within that marriage, there are circles, right? These interlocking circles, almost like if you can imagine a dip and then a rise and then a dip and then a rise that intersects. These are where the identities within that role shift. For myself and for David, I can see that we've moved through at least 3 significant shifts in how we see ourselves, both in the roles that we play as we move deeper and deeper into our sense of self, into our identities, as we shed other roles. Like when David shedded, being active duty military, and he became a retired from the army. The role that I shed as we had raised our 2 sons, and then I was no longer a mother in the same way as I was raising them as I am now as a mother of grown men. It's a shift in our role. And that shift, that releasing of that skin, invites us to move deeper into our sense of self. I've mentioned, if you're an avid listener of this podcast, I just want to welcome you. Thank you for being with me. Encourage you to communicate with me if you're not already, about what you're listening to, about what you're hearing, about what you're learning, about what we're exploring together. So I mentioned before Yuval Noah Harari and his book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. If you're new to the podcast, hello. It's very, very nice to meet you. Welcome to my digital home. Make yourself comfortable. So Yuval Harari talks about the best skill that we can teach our children as we move into the 21st century is reinvention. Really the best skill that we can also learn for ourselves. Because the only thing that is going to be constant in our lives is change. And right now we cannot predict what our kids, our children, the youth need to know 20 years from now. We don't know. There are meta skills, right? The skills that overlie everything else. One of those is reinvention. And one of those is learning how to learn. So Yuval says that we're holding on to a stable identity, job, or worldview puts us at risk. If we want something to be stable for us, and I of all people know it is an intrinsic need to want stability, to want security, but it puts us at risk. And so he encourages in his writing that we learn the ability both to learn and to reinvent ourselves constantly. He talks about us looking at our identity as a tent instead of a foundation of cement, so that it's easier to pick up and move around. He goes on to say that we will survive and flourish if we build our mental flexibility and our emotional balance, because we are going to repeatedly have to learn how to let go. And it is going to be so important for us to feel at home in the unknown. So going back to the questions that I asked when we began, know what you are, know who you are, and most important, this is most important, know what you want from life. Not what life can give you, but what you want to create in life. What do you want to grow into next? Start with you. This isn't, that sort of idealistic, what do I want to be when I grow up story. This is life as an experience, because there is no end. I know when I first imagined that, what do I want to be when I grow up? It was one thing. It was the thing that got me to a place that was finite, that was definitive, that was sort of that mountaintop. And even if it is a mountaintop, just know that then you're going to climb down that mountain and then climb another mountain. So it's not what you want to be when you grow up and that's it, but what do you want to experience? What do you want to grow into next? And that's the shift in mindset. If you don't already see it that way, it's an invitation for you to explore what seeing the world in that way might offer you. This is a period of time where we begin to align ourselves with our deeper story. I know in the past for me, I had boxes that I would put pieces of Vivian in. I had containers that were allowed to be in certain areas, and they were very clear. And it gave me a feeling actually of safety and of comfort, because I know who to be and what to be, depending on what box or what container I was in. And this is more of an alignment of all of those things together, of letting them swim with each other. So what are you growing into next? Because reinvention of ourselves happens over and over and over again, whether we want it to or not. See, that's the thing. It's going to happen. There's no way to keep it at bay. So as we grow, as we emerge, what often happens is that we return to a purer place where we were ourselves. It may have been in our childhood. It may have been before we were married. It may have been before we started a certain job. It's a period of time where we may return or just remember, I really used to like doing this, or I really prefer to do that. Start with you. So if you're moving through your period of reinvention, if you're spring, if you are emerging, you might be saying these kinds of phrases to yourself. I wonder when I stopped doing, I'm making this up, practicing guitar. I've never done that. But I used to love the hours that I would spend practicing my guitar. It could be anything. This is the period of returning to that, of remembering it. Or if you're in a period of reinvention, of growth, it may have been in response to something happen on the outside. Something that shifted you without you wanting it to be shifted. So what I've noticed as I've worked with Love Being Human, massaged it, understood it, is that I'm seeing it now as 3 phases. When we first were born, we began with birth, right? We had to inhale first, starting with you, giving yourself breath before we could exhale. So we were born into this world, and then we grew. So this growth period is long. And then there's a death at some point. But inner transformational change, we actually began with the death. If you go back to the episodes from the winter, way back in the fall, you'll notice that I invested a significant amount of time on the idea of letting something go, on letting something die, on grieving an old role, an old even mindset or an attitude. That death, for me, happens first. And then the period we are now, which is growth. And I'm super excited. The rebirth actually is what I'll focus on in the April episodes. So as we focus on growth, a couple of points that I want to make. It's consistent over time. And the only way to understand what it is we're growing into is by embodying it. And embodiment means that you are experiencing it, that you are recognizing the experience that you're having and you understand it. The other thing about growth in this field, in this area, in this playground, in this kind of sandbox, is that it is about you unfolding energetically as a way of being, as a lifestyle, as the way that you move through the world, rather than a sense of block time. An example that's coming up for me is, it was easy for me to identify the sense of time that it took to move from kindergarten to graduating high school. We all know it takes a definitive amount of time to do that, 12 or more years. But this kind of growth can happen faster or slower. It's not easy to say to yourself, this is the box that I'm going to allow for this period to happen. You can. No one's telling you you can't, but it's not as definitive as that block of time that it takes to finish a education or to a training or to get a certification or to, those things that feel like you've accomplished something. So just be gentle with yourself, because this is more about your unfolding. So imagine it instead of a destination, like a path from start to end. It's kind of like a flower blooming. It happens in its due season, in its due time. So that may be considered more of a spiritual view of time. And so allow your vision of time, your experience with time, to be more long-term. One of the biggest obstacles to this is doubt and fear. And so I want to touch for a tiny bit on how you gain courage. I mentioned that you have to embody something. That means that it has to be rooted in your body, in your space, and in your energy. That's how you can gain courage. If there's fear, you can just reground yourself into the moment. What am I sensing? What am I smelling? What am I seeing? What is happening in the moment? Start to experience that. Name it. Feel it. Changing patterns in ourselves, in our sense of identity, or in our sense of, or in our role, is difficult for us. So one way that we can travel that path of change is by telling a better story. I'm inviting you to claim your creative potential. Know that any story you're telling yourself is unfinished and that anything is possible. But as humans, we really don't break bad habits or let go of limiting patterns easily. Instead, we build new ones to step into. So a way that you can claim your creative potential is maybe to start a project. This whole episode, if it was summarized into one word, it would be create. Create as a way to close the gap between your intention and your action. I have 3 P's to share with you. The second one is partnership. Recognize that you are creating with yourself. Your role, your human, who you are right now, is creating with your soul. Allow the flow of you in your purest essence to guide you, to inform you. Co-create in partnership with that self. And remember that you do have the power. You have the ability to see differently. You have the ability to choose differently. And you have the ability to act differently. Act in ways that enhance you, that give shape to your dreams, to your aspirations. And for me, it's the name of the podcast, Within. My invitation is always to go inward first. See what's happening in there. See what's happening with you. Allow that to happen. That was a big learning lesson for me. I thought that I could push things away if it wasn't something that I wanted, like an experience, an emotion. You have to allow it. You have to allow it to move through you. And in the February episodes, the ones just before this, I really feel like for myself, the key is giving yourself a little bit of extra love. Whether you call that kindness or whether you call that self-compassion, it is so important to learn to befriend yourself. Because for so long in my life, I didn't know it. I didn't realize it. I didn't see it. But I was not a friend to myself. And that was not as fun as being a friend to myself is now. So recognize that in this season, in the spring, you are moving through a process of growth. And one tool that you can use to help move yourself is writing. So if you're moving forward, if you're giving shape to something, if you're envisioning your future, move forward. Do that. Revisit the October episodes to help you frame what that future looks like. And writing may also invite you to look back, to remember, to see the past again, but not to revisit an old pain. Like I said earlier, this is to remember what your dreams were. Remember what your passion was. So I invite you to pick up a project, create. I invite you to remember that this is a partnership of you and your higher self, your better self, your soul self. And I promise you that you have the power. So as we wrap up this March episode on creating, I want to remind you why I created this podcast. It was in direct response to a near-death experience. It was in direct response to a term that was whispered in my ear after I moved through my metamorphosis, after I moved through my change. And it almost felt like this is the tool that you have. Learn to love being human, the wholeness of your humanity and your divinity, and share that. I said, no, can't do it for you. Sorry, pick someone else. And then I was hit by a car, and I had this experience that changed everything for me. And I no longer had the fear that was holding me back from becoming what I am and who I am now, and just sharing these lessons and this framework that's come up. So that's why I'm here. That's why this was created, just as a tool, because when I moved through it, I felt very alone, and no one should have to feel that way. So what I'm inviting you to do is visit my digital home at viviancarrasco.com. Scroll through whatever page you happen to land on. Look for a spot where you can put your name and your email. It should be at the end of every blog and podcast and pretty much everywhere. Most of the buttons on my page say yes, please. And I want to let you know why they say that. They say yes because, like I said earlier, you have the power to make a choice. The button says yes because that is a micro commitment, a micro choice. And then it says please. And the way that I mean that isn't like a request, and it's not meant towards me at all. It's actually an intention that you're setting, a form of prayer that you are putting out into the world. Because, like I said earlier, this is a partnership. You are co-creating with your highest self, with your better self, with who you are meant to become. Thank you so much for journeying with me in this playground of discovery of who we are, what we want, and where we're going, what we're becoming. I invite your comments, your questions at Vivian@viviancarrasco.com. Feel free to get in touch with me in whatever way is most convenient for you. Until next time on the Within You podcast, may you be well.